Do you spend days or even weeks writing OT assessment reports? I'm Ralph Langner, and in this video I'll show you how you can produce top-notch reports within a fraction of the time. If you have to deliver comprehensive OT assessment or audit reports, chances are that you hate the bulk of work that is involved in the process. Well, at least if you're like me. Because I have worked for 20 years as an OT security consultant, and there were always two things that I really hated about my job. First, discovering and collecting and compiling all the asset inventory data that forms the basis of a report. And second, actually writing the report, as it usually involves heavy copying and pasting exercises that are just boring and extremely time-consuming. Now imagine both tasks could be automated, which would allow you to focus on the more interesting parts of report writing, namely to express and justify your expert opinion. And this is exactly what the OT-based report writer module does. Let's see how it works. Let's first look at a sample report produced by OT-based report writer. As you can see, it's a Microsoft Word document that you can modify and append, for example, by placing your logo and company name on the front page. The table of contents gives you an idea of the overall structure of the report. So it all starts with an executive summary. Then there are some project details mentioned, such as the time frame and team members. Then we have a chapter on the asset overview, which includes a breakdown of the major automation vendors, the computer product types, the operating system versions, and so on. The next chapter is a list of networks that have been identified along with the endpoints in those networks. Then a similar thing on OT systems, which could be distributed control systems or manufacturing lines. And there is a whole chapter on vulnerabilities from various angles. So you get the vulnerabilities for the devices, you get the vulnerabilities by age. And in this sample report that we have done, you only see critical and high priority vulnerabilities. As you will see later, OT-based report writer lets you decide which level of detail you want to see in the report. So you can go all in and also list the low priority vulnerabilities if you want to. Certainly that just makes the report longer, and usually readers unfortunately don't pay that much attention to medium and low priority vulnerabilities. Then there is a chapter on protection, which is mostly about security patches. Policy review and audit, and usually it also has to go into an assessment and audit report. Then finally there are the assessment and recommendations remarks, and then we have a large appendix in this example with device details, and you can think of that basically as a OT asset inventory for printout. So as you can see, the whole report is more than 700 pages long, and this is just because we have included the device details. You don't have to. So in the report writer, you can select to have those device details be printed or not. When you produce a report for a regulatory authority, you will usually want to include the device details in order to make your assessment and your reporting more credible, because the regulatory authority would have the opportunity to verify the results and also verify it on site that your asset inventory is up to snuff. So let's start with the executive summary. As you can see, this is just 3 paragraphs of lorem ipsum text, for the simple reason that this is the summary is not something that we could write automatically, as it will usually also reflect on the major findings and recommendations. So this is what you would replace with individual text. Similar thing with the project details, also some lorem ipsum here. But we just give you a couple of hints on how to fill that section. So for example, for the scope, you would identify the project scope, such as a specific site or plant section or network. Then you mentioned the team members and so on. Now here is where the real meat starts. So in the asset overview, you first see a breakdown of asset categories. And this starts with a nice donut chart. where you see the number of automation devices and as opposed to computers, networks, and other. And in the diagram, you only see percentages. In the table below the diagram, you can see the real number. So for example, we see here that we are talking about a total of roughly 1,200 devices, from which 880 are automation devices. Then we have the automation product types broken down by actuator, operator panel, PLC, and RTUs. Again, the first is the diagram, then is the table with the exact numbers. And as the author of the report, if you wanted to, you could certainly also add text here and anywhere else in the report where you could highlight a couple of findings. Then we have the top 10 automation vendors. Well, in this case, it's actually only 4, given our sample data set here. 10 network product vendors. Again, it's not exactly 10, it's a little bit less. Then we have computer product types, broken down by desktops and servers. Operating system versions, certainly very interesting. The diagram tells us about the top 5. And in this specific example, we see that we have more than half computers still running Windows XP. So this is certainly a finding that you don't want to see. And also down here, we have the accurate and exact numbers in the table. Now, this is in this next chapter, this is where we see a listing of all the networks that went into this report. And one thing is noteworthy here, as it tells you in the introduction, networks with critical devices are highlighted in red and critical devices are marked by underline. So we are actually starting out with a network that contains critical devices, therefore it shows in red. I think the next one is non-critical. Let's just scroll down. There is a non-critical network. So whenever we are talking about networks with critical endpoints, then the whole network is color-coded in red to just draw the attention of the reader to that network. And the endpoints are broken down by their categories. So we start out with the automation gear. And then we also have computers and networks and network devices. What we see here is that from our automation equipment, there are a couple of drives in our example that are critical, and we could check out in detail which these are in the device details appendix at the end of the report. But just to give you an idea how that works. So the first item here in the listing is always the device ID as it appears in OT-based asset center. And the device ID is followed by the host name, the DNS name of the device in brackets. So this makes it pretty easy to look up details for this device if you would just search for either the device name or the device ID at the end of the report in the asset details or in asset center, and then you would see exactly what this device is all about and what it does, the location of the device, and so forth. In our example, we have a lot of networks, so we just scroll through this rather quickly. Next chapter is the vulnerabilities. It starts out with a bar chart for the vulnerabilities for all devices broken down by priority. So you see here that the bulk of vulnerabilities that affect the sample data in this report has a high priority. Then we have a whole bunch of medium priority vulnerabilities and let's see, well, more than 1,200 critical vulnerabilities. This chart right here shows us the number of vulnerabilities, critical priority vulnerabilities by age. So, and also the bullet points down here, they're also produced automatically. So you can build on that text if you want to in your reporting. First, we learned that there is a total of 1,214 vulnerabilities with critical priority. Oldest critical priority vulnerability was published in 2015. And the highest number of critical vulnerabilities per day is associated with CVEs published in June 2018, this bar right here. A similar diagram, but in this case now the data is cumulated. Below there is the timeline, and then here on the vertical axis you can see how all those critical priority vulnerabilities cumulate until they reach 100% as of the latest recording date. Same thing for high priority vulnerabilities. Next section is about the top 10 critical CVEs, or common vulnerability enumerators. And for each of these, as you would probably expect, you get the CVE identifier that you could also look up on NIST or MITRE. And here is where you get the additional details, such as the base core, then the description, the publication date, and the number of vulnerable devices. Then we have a nice word cloud with all the major software products with critical vulnerabilities. Now this gives you a high-level idea about the software products that make up for most of your critical CVEs. And in our example, it's pretty straightforward. So Adobe Flash Player stands out, followed by the Microsoft.NET Framework and by Firefox. Then we have devices by CVE priority. So this is no longer about the number of vulnerabilities. This is about the number of devices that come with critical, high, medium, or low priority vulnerabilities. And you are certainly ending up with completely different numbers as compared to the charts that we have discussed earlier. So now we see that all the critical vulnerabilities affect a total of 52 devices, and this gives us something to work with. Next chapter is about protection, which means about security patches. In this diagram, you can see the security patch recency of the Windows computers in our sample database. And the timeline at the bottom shows you the number of years from today. So 0 is pretty much today, or the time when the report was written. And then the graph goes back in time, and it ends up with 100% of patched devices. And the text below the graph, which is also automatically generated, tells us that only a total of 21% devices have seen their last security patch within 1 year. Only 30% of the devices have seen their last security patch within 2 years. Next diagram, number of security patches installed over time. And this is for all the Windows computers in our sample database. So what we learn is that the highest number of security patches, which is 161, was installed back in 2016. And on average, over the last 12 months, there were only 2 security patches installed for the whole installed base. Next chapter is policy review and audit, and this is pretty much only lorem ipsum text, because there is no way that OT-Base could automatically review and audit policies. So this just gives you an idea what a reader would expect to see here. And if you are producing this report only for internal purposes, maybe you could just get rid of that chapter, and you will see in a couple of minutes that you can simply disable the output of that chapter in Report Writer. Finally, we have the assessment and recommendations. Also, this is just lorem ipsum text. And here at the end, there's the appendix with the device details. And as I said earlier, this is pretty much an asset inventory that you can print out if you want to or if you have to. So for each device that is referenced in the report, you see a breakdown of the major characteristics, such as the make and model, the product type, in this case it's an actuator, the firmware version, and so on. And for devices that have a criticality rating, you'll also see those devices highlighted by a red heading. Now, if you remember, we are talking about 1200 devices, so you will expect this appendix to be quite lengthy, so we won't go through it in detail. There's only a couple of things that I would like to point out. So for example, for the PLCs And you also see the number of vulnerabilities for each device. So for example, in this case right here for this Siemens PLC, we see that it is vulnerable for 3 high priority vulnerabilities and 3 medium priority vulnerabilities. For the Windows computers, you see details such as make and model. You see the operating system version, license key, which is X'd out for obvious reasons in this sample report. The number of patches, the date of the last patch, and all the vulnerabilities broken down by priority. Now let's look how you can produce such a report with OT-based Report Writer. The first thing to understand is that Report Writer is an external component, external in regard to OT-based Asset Center. It is not included in Asset Center, it's rather a standalone application. So what we need to do first is we need to export data from OT-based Asset Center. And what we are going to export is all the configuration data for those devices that we want to include in our report. In order to do that, we go to the device inventory and set the scope appropriately. And the benefit of that is that you could now pick, for example, a specific location, a specific site for which you want to do the report, or even a specific network if you wanted to, depending on what you want to achieve with the report. So once that you have set the scope appropriately, the only thing that's left to do is to click on JSON export. Once that we start OT-based Report Writer, it will automatically ask us for the input file, which in our case is a portable inventory data file. This is the high-level JSON format that we are using for the export. And as you see, the dialog box that is popped up here only lists JSON files. So I can only pick a JSON file from my folders. So let's use this latest JSON file that we have just produced and then click on Open. The next step is to specify the output file, which is our Microsoft Word file that will hold the report. And we can just use any file name that we like OT-based sample report, and then click on Save. Now we have the opportunity to adjust some settings. The first setting involves the level of detail that you want to see in the vulnerability reporting. By default, OT-based Report Writer will only report on critical priority CVEs. If you want to be more verbose, you can change that to critical and high priority. You could also include medium priority, and you can certainly include all CVEs, which means also those with low priority. Let's look at these 3 check boxes below. The first box here tells Report Writer if you want to include that CVE word cloud that you have seen earlier, which informs the reader about the most vulnerable software products that you have installed. And the reason why you can choose to switch this on and off is because it is very time consuming. For the word cloud, Report Writer downloads up to 1,000 CVE descriptions from the NIST website. And since NIST unfortunately throttles the traffic to the NIST CVE download site, this is the reason why this is time consuming. And we're not talking about hours, we were talking about maybe 20 to 30 minutes. But you know, when you're just starting out with your first experiments with Report Writer, you might just choose to leave that box unchecked. But for our purposes, we just check it so that you can see what happens. The next checkbox allows you to decide on whether you want to include a policy chapter template or not. As you have seen earlier in the sample report, there is not much that we could automatically write into that policy chapter because OT-based cannot audit your policies. It can only give you a couple of ideas, a couple of topics that you should address for that chapter. But if you know right away that you don't need that policy chapter because let's just say the report is only for internal purposes, then you can just leave that unchecked. And finally, this is about the last checkbox is about the device details that you have seen earlier, those roughly 600, 700 pages of text that you would probably also need only for regulatory authorities, but not for internal purposes. And the only thing left to do is to click the Start button. In the status down here, the report writer tells you what it's presently doing. And this is now the section that I mentioned earlier, where report writer connects to the NIST website and downloads the CVE descriptions of up to 1,000 critical vulnerabilities. And you see how that takes some time. Again, this is just for establishing the connection to NIST. In our case, it's about 432 critical vulnerabilities, which are now processed sequentially. And in the interest of saving time, we will just step forward to the next step. Now our report is ready, as we can see down here in the status bar. And let's have a look at the result. So there are two items that you have to do for post-processing. First, report writer cannot automatically generate the table of contents, but that is not really a biggie because, as you know, this is pretty easy to do in Microsoft Word. So there's your table of contents. And as we had expected, it looks pretty similar to the report that we had checked out earlier. The major difference is that we now also see the data on on medium priority and low priority vulnerabilities that we had specifically included in this report. And we don't have the policy chapter. We don't have the device details either. So in this case, our report is only 44 pages long. And talking about pages, the other thing that you would want to add manually is the page numbers, which is another item that report writer unfortunately cannot insert automatically. So there's your page number, and our report is pretty much good to go. With OT-based report writer, you can eliminate the boring and time-consuming tasks of producing OT assessment and audit reports. As a consultant, that also means that you can produce more reports in the same amount of time and also generate more revenue. To find out more about OT-base, please go to langner.com/OT-base.